I've been driving trucks for nearly 30 years, and I've had my share of strange encounters on the road. But nothing comes close to what happened last winter. I still think about it every time I'm alone at night, driving down some dark stretch of highway. It was early January, and I was hauling a load of industrial equipment from Denver to Chicago. The roads were empty, the snow was falling steadily, and the temperature had dropped well below freezing. I remember it was a Tuesday night because I had a radio station playing some late-night talk show, and the host kept talking about the blizzard warnings across the Midwest. But I was on a tight schedule, and I didn't have time to stop and wait out the weather. Around midnight, I decided to take a detour through a smaller highway to avoid some of the heavier snow predicted on the main route. Highway 53. I'd never driven it before, but it looked like a straight shot through farmland and small towns. Figured it might save me an hour or two. The road was almost completely deserted. My headlights cut through the falling snow, illuminating the thick pine trees that lined the sides of the road. There was a heavy fog rolling in, and visibility was getting worse by the minute. I had to slow down to a crawl just to make sure I stayed on the road. After a while, I saw a figure standing on the side of the road, just barely visible through the fog and snow. At first, I thought it was an animal, but as I got closer, I realized it was a woman. She was wearing a thick winter coat and a scarf that covered most of her face. Her hair was wet and matted down, and she looked like she'd been out in the snow for a long time. I pulled over and rolled down the window. "You need a ride?" I called out. She hesitated for a moment, then nodded and came over to the truck. When she got closer, I could see her face was pale, her lips blue from the cold. She looked scared, almost desperate. I unlocked the door, and she climbed up into the passenger seat. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "My car broke down a few miles back, and I've been walking for hours." I nodded and turned the heat up. "No problem. You're lucky I came by. This road's pretty empty tonight." She didn't say anything, just stared straight ahead, her hands trembling as she tried to warm them up. I figured she must have been freezing, so I offered her my thermos of coffee. She took it with a shaky hand and sipped it slowly. After a few minutes of silence, I tried to make small talk. "Where you headed?" She glanced over at me, her eyes wide and glassy. "I was going to visit my sister," she said, her voice still shaky. But I got lost. I don't know where I am." I nodded again, trying to reassure her. "You're on Highway 53, about 50 miles from the next town. I can drop you off there if you like." She nodded, but she didn't seem comforted. She just kept staring straight ahead, her eyes darting nervously around the cab. The snow was coming down harder now, and the road was getting slick. I had to focus on keeping the truck steady, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about this woman. She seemed distant. Almost like she wasn't really there. We drove in silence for a while. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the wipers scraping against the windshield. Then, out of nowhere, she spoke again. "You shouldn't have picked me up." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I glanced over at her, but she was still staring straight ahead, her expression unreadable. "Why's that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She turned to look at me, her eyes wide and filled with fear. "Because he's out there. And he's coming." I felt a jolt of panic in my chest. Who's out there?" She didn't answer. She just turned back to the road, her hands gripping the coffee thermos so tightly I thought she might crush it. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, or something, following us, but there was nothing. Just the snow and the dark, empty road. I was about to ask her again when she suddenly gasped, her eyes widening in terror. "There!" she shouted, pointing out the windshield. "Do you see him?" I followed her gaze, but all I saw was snow and fog. "I don't see anything," I said, my voice a little more unsteady now. "What are you talking about?" She turned to me, her face pale as a ghost. "He's there. Standing in the road." I squinted, trying to see through the thick curtain of snow, and for a moment, I thought I saw something, a dark shape, maybe a figure, standing in the middle of the road. But then it was gone, swallowed up by the fog. I felt a shiver run down my spine. "Lady, I don't know what you're talking about. There's nobody there." She shook her head frantically. "No, you don't understand. He's always there. Always watching." I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. "Who is he?" She didn't answer. She just kept staring ahead, her breathing growing faster and more erratic. I tried to stay calm, keep my focus on the road, but my heart was pounding in my chest. We drove in silence for what felt like hours, the tension in the cab growing thicker with each passing mile. The snow was coming down so hard now that I could barely see a few feet in front of the truck. I was about to tell her we needed to stop when I heard it, a loud thump from the back of the truck. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a stop on the icy road. I turned to the woman, but she was gone. The passenger seat was empty, the door slightly ajar, snow blowing in. My heart was racing as I scrambled out of the cab, looking around frantically. There were no footprints in the snow, no sign of her at all. I grabbed a flashlight from the cab and walked to the back of the truck. My breath was fogging up in the cold air, and my hands were shaking. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I reached the back of the truck and shone the flashlight around, but there was nothing. Just the empty, snow-covered road stretching into the darkness. I felt a cold sweat on my forehead, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I turned back to the truck, ready to get the hell out of there, when I saw it, a set of footprints leading away from the truck, disappearing into the trees. I hesitated for a moment, then followed them, my boots crunching in the snow. The tracks were fresh, leading deeper into the woods. I couldn't see far, but I kept going, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The footprints stopped at the edge of a clearing, and there in the middle of the snow-covered ground, was a car. An old, rusted sedan, half buried in the snow. I shined the flashlight on it, my heart pounding. The windows were shattered, the doors hanging open, and inside, I could just make out the shape of a woman slumped over the wheel. My breath caught in my throat. It was her. The same woman I'd picked up on the road. I stepped closer, my hands trembling, and shined the light on her face. Her eyes were open, staring straight ahead, her skin pale and lifeless. Her mouth was twisted in a frozen scream. I stumbled back, my mind racing, trying to make sense of it. She'd been in my truck, I'd seen her, heard her voice. But here she was, dead and cold in this abandoned car. I turned and ran back to the truck, my heart pounding in my chest. I jumped into the cab, slammed the door, and floored the gas, speeding down the road as fast as I could. The radio crackled to life with static, and for a brief moment, I heard a voice, her voice. You shouldn't have picked me up. I didn't stop driving until I saw the lights of the next town, and I haven't taken that road since. Sometimes, late at night, when I'm driving through the snow, I still see her face in the darkness watching, waiting. And I wonder if she's still out there, looking for a ride. I couldn't get that night out of my head. For days, I felt like I was in a fog, replaying everything over and over again. The snow, the woman's pale face, the voice on the radio. I told myself it was just a trick of the mind, maybe a stress-induced hallucination from driving too long without a break. But the images stuck with me, like a stubborn stain I couldn't wash out. A few weeks later, I was back on the road, this time on a route down south. Warmer weather, clearer skies, more traffic, a far cry from the snow-choked highway in Ohio. I was starting to feel like maybe I'd shaken the whole thing off. Maybe it was just some freak accident of the mind, nothing more. I was even laughing again, enjoying the drive, tuning into a local rock station as the miles rolled by. But as much as I wanted to forget, it seemed like fate had other plans. It started with a call from an old friend of mine, Dan. Dan had been driving trucks longer than I had and was one of the few guys I trusted with my life on the road. He was a no-nonsense kind of guy, never one to indulge in ghost stories or superstitions. So when he called me, I knew something serious was up. "Roy, you got a minute?" he asked, his voice tense. "Yeah, what's going on?" "You ever been up on Highway 53? Somewhere around Ohio?" My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't told anyone about that night, not even Dan. "Yeah, I've been there." "Why?" Dan hesitated, then continued. "I had a run up there a few nights ago. Thought I saw something strange. A woman, standing by the road. I didn't think much of it at first, but then she just vanished. Like 1 second she was there, and the next gone. I pulled over, but there was no one around." A cold shiver ran down my spine. "What did she look like?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "Long dark hair, old winter coat, kinda pale. She looked like she was lost or something." "You know her?" I swallowed hard. Yeah, I think I do." Dan was silent for a moment, then let out a shaky laugh. "Man, I thought I was losing my mind out there. But now I'm starting to think maybe it's something else. What the hell is going on, Roy?" I took a deep breath, then told him everything. About picking her up, about the strange things she'd said, and about finding her body in the car. I could hear him breathing heavily on the other end of the line as I finished. "Jesus," he muttered. "You're telling me she's dead? And you saw her alive?" "Yeah," I replied, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't know how, but yeah. I'm not crazy, then. Something's out there, and it's not normal." Dan was quiet for a long time before he spoke again. "There's gotta be an explanation for this. Maybe we should go back, check it out together. I hesitated. Going back wasn't exactly on my to-do list. But Dan was my friend, and I couldn't shake the feeling that if we didn't face it, we'd never get any peace. Alright, I finally agreed. Let's do it. But we need to be careful. Whatever's out there, it's not friendly. A few days later, we met up at a truck stop a few miles from the highway entrance. The sky was overcast, and there was a chill in the air that felt out of place for this time of year. We grabbed a cup of coffee and made a plan. I'd drive the route I'd taken that night, and Dan would follow close behind in his rig. If we saw anything, we'd stop and check it out together. As we drove, the road felt different. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching for us. The fog rolled in slowly, thicker than before, wrapping around the truck like a shroud. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I kept my eyes on the road, scanning for any sign of movement. And then I saw her. She was standing in the same spot I'd first seen her, just at the edge of the fog. Her hair was wet, her face even paler than I remembered. She looked directly at me, her eyes wide and pleading. I hit the brakes and grabbed the radio. Dan, you see her? Yeah, I see her, he replied, his voice tight. Stay in the truck. Don't get out. But before I could respond, the woman stepped onto the road, directly into the path of my truck. I swerved hard trying to avoid her, but the tires hit a patch of ice, and the truck skidded sideways. I fought to keep control, but I felt the rear wheels slide out, and then the truck jackknifed, slamming sideways into the guardrail. Dan pulled up behind me, jumping out of his truck and running over. Roy, you okay? I nodded, shaken but unhurt. Did you see her? Dan's face was pale. I saw her, and then she was gone. Just vanished. We stood there in the snow, the engines of our trucks rumbling softly behind us, staring at the spot where she'd been. There were no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there at all. What the hell is going on, man? Dan muttered, his breath visible in the cold air. I didn't have an answer. I just knew that whatever was happening, it wasn't over. We decided to get back in the trucks and keep driving. The fog was getting thicker, and I didn't want to stick around any longer than we had to. But as we started down the road again, I noticed something in the rearview mirror. A car. Old, rusted, covered in snow. And standing next to it, the woman. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, just like before. But there was something else. A man standing behind her, his hand on her shoulder. He was tall, wearing a dark coat, his face hidden in the shadow. I felt my heart leap into my throat. Dan, I said into the radio, my voice shaking, do you see them? Dan's voice came back, filled with tension. Yeah, Roy. I see them. We stopped the trucks and got out, keeping our distance. The man didn't move, just stood there with his hand on her shoulder, watching us. The woman's mouth was moving, but no sound came out. She looked terrified, her eyes darting between us and the man. What do we do? Den Visperet. I don't know, I replied. I don't know. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, watching them, waiting for something to happen. And then, without warning, the man turned and started walking into the woods, pulling the woman along with him. She resisted, but he yanked her harder, and she stumbled after him. I felt a surge of anger, something deep and primal. We can't just let him take her, I said. We have to do something. Dan nodded, his face grim. Let's go. We grabbed our flashlights and started after them, trudging through the snow, our breath coming out in clouds. The fog was thick, and it was hard to see more than a few feet ahead, but we kept moving, following the faint sound of footsteps crunching in the snow. We pushed deeper into the woods, the trees closing in around us, the fog growing thicker with every step. I could just make out the shape of the man ahead, still pulling the woman along, her feet dragging in the snow. Hey! I shouted. Let her go. The man stopped and slowly turned around. And that's when I saw his face, or what was left of it. His skin was gray and rotted, his eyes sunken and hollow, his mouth twisted into a cruel smile. He spoke, his voice like gravel scraping against metal. She's mine now. And you shouldn't have come back. Before we could react, the woman's face changed, her eyes turning cold and dark. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, and the fog around us thickened, swirling like a living thing. I felt an icy grip on my chest, and my flashlight flickered, then went out. Dan grabbed my arm. Roy, we need to get out of here. Now. We turned and ran, stumbling through the snow, the fog pressing in around us. I could hear the sound of footsteps behind us, getting closer, and a low, raspy whisper that sent chills down my spine. You can't escape. We reached the trucks, breathless and terrified, and jumped in, slamming the doors. I turned the key, and the engine roared to life. I floored the gas, the tires spinning on the icy road, and we sped away, leaving the fog and the woods behind. I don't know how long we drove, but eventually the fog lifted, and the road was clear again. We pulled into a gas station, shaking and exhausted, and sat there in silence, trying to catch our breath. Dan looked over at me, his face pale. "What the hell was that, Roy?" I shook my head, my hands trembling on the wheel.
"I don't know, man. I don't know."
But whatever it was, I don't think it's done with us yet. I couldn't sleep for days after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that man's face, or what was left of it, and the woman's wide, terrified eyes. I felt like I was stuck in a loop, trapped somewhere between reality and a nightmare. And I couldn't shake the feeling that this thing, whatever it was, had marked us. Dan called me a few days later. He sounded just as rattled as I was, but he was trying to play it off. "Roy, I've been thinking," he said. "We need to find out what's going on out there. I can't live with this hanging over me, man. It's like it's always there, right behind me."
"You feel that?"
I did. I felt it in every nerve. Like a weight I couldn't see, pressing down on me.
"Yeah," I muttered. "I feel it. So what do we do?"
"There's an old guy I know, lives out in the sticks near that highway. Name's Henry. Used to be a cop, did some paranormal investigation on the side. If anyone's gonna know what's going on, it's him."
"You in?" I hesitated.
The logical part of me wanted to say no, just let it go, move on. But there was something else, a pull I couldn't ignore. "Yeah," I finally said.
"I'm in."
The next morning, we drove out to Henry's place, a small, weather-beaten house on the edge of a dense forest. The windows were dark, and the front porch sagged like it hadn't been repaired in decades. The place looked as old as Henry himself. Henry was a wiry old man with a permanent frown and a pair of eyes that looked like they'd seen more than they should have. He listened quietly as we told him what had happened, not saying a word until we finished. Then he leaned back in his chair, puffed on his pipe, and stared out the window for a long moment. "Highway 53, you say?" he finally muttered, his voice gravelly and low. "I've heard of that place.
Bad history there. Very bad."
"What do you mean?" Dan asked, leaning forward. Henry looked at us, his eyes narrowed. "Folks around here don't like to talk about it. But there's been stories for years. Strange things. People disappearing, sightings of things that don't belong in this world.
Some say it's cursed.
Others think there's something unnatural out there." I felt a chill run down my spine. "You think it's a ghost?" I asked, my voice sounding more uncertain than I intended. Henry shook his head slowly.
"Not a ghost.
Not exactly.
Something older.
Something that feeds on fear, on the lost and the lonely. It takes people, uses them, makes them part of itself." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. "Like that woman," I whispered.
"She said he was coming for her. She knew." Henry nodded. "She's trapped, Roy."
"Whatever it is, it's using her to lure others in. And if you've seen her, if you've heard her voice, then it knows you. It knows your name." Dan shifted in his seat, looking uncomfortable.
"So, what do we do?
How do we get rid of it?" Henry let out a heavy sigh.
"You don't."
"Not easily, anyway. But there's a place, an old church, abandoned for years. It's near where you saw them. Some say it's a place where the barrier between our world and whatever else is out there is thin. If you can make it there, confront whatever it is, you might be able to break its hold. But it won't be easy."
"Why there?" I asked.
"Why that church?" Henry's eyes darkened. "Because that's where it all started." The next night, we found ourselves standing outside the old church. It was half buried in snow, its roof caved in on one side, the wooden door hanging by a single rusted hinge. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the wind howled through the broken windows, carrying with it the faint sound of whispers. I felt a tremor in my hands, and I gripped my flashlight tighter. Dan was beside me, looking as tense as I felt.
"You sure about this?" he asked. "No," I admitted.
"But we've come this far." We pushed open the door, and it creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the empty church. The inside was dark and cold, the air thick with dust and the smell of mildew. Pews lay scattered and broken, and a large cracked cross hung crookedly at the front of the room. We moved slowly down the aisle, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. Every step felt heavy, like the air itself was pushing back against us. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, a steady drumbeat of fear. And then we heard it, a soft, distant whisper. A woman's voice, coming from somewhere deeper inside the church.
"Help me."
Dan and I exchanged a glance, and I could see the fear in his eyes. But we kept moving, drawn forward by that voice, even though every instinct in my body was screaming to turn back. As we approached the altar, the whisper grew louder, more desperate.
Please help me.
I stopped, my flashlight flickering as if something was draining the batteries. Where are you?
I called out. And then I saw her.
The woman, standing at the far end of the room, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror.
Please, she begged, her voice breaking. He's coming. He's here.
I felt a rush of adrenaline. We're here to help you, I said, taking a step closer.
But as I did, her expression changed.
The fear melted away, replaced by a cold, knowing smile. No, she said, her voice low and mocking. You're here to stay. Before I could react, the temperature in the room plummeted, and the darkness around us seemed to thicken, closing in like a living thing. The windows shattered, glass spraying everywhere, and the church door slammed shut behind us with a deafening bang. Dan shouted something, but his voice was drowned out by a deep, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I turned and saw it, the man, the one from the woods, standing in the shadows. His face was twisted into a grotesque grin, his eyes glowing with a sickly, unnatural light. You shouldn't have come back, he snarled, his voice echoing in my skull. I felt a wave of cold wash over me, and my legs went numb. I tried to move, to run, but I was rooted to the spot.
Den grabbet my arm, pulling back. Roy!
Snap out of it. We have to go. The man started to move toward us, his steps slow and deliberate, like he had all the time in the world. The woman's voice echoed through the church, laughing now, a high, shrill sound that cut through me like a knife. I fumbled for the lighter in my pocket, my hands shaking.
The church, I muttered. We burn it.
We have to burn it. Dan hesitated for a moment, then nodded, his face grim.
Do it.
I flicked the lighter, the small flame flickering in the darkness, and I grabbed a piece of cloth from one of the broken pews. I lit it, the flame catching quickly, and tossed it onto the dry wood. The fire spread fast, the dry wood catching like kindling, and soon the whole church was filled with smoke and flames. The man screamed, a horrible, inhuman sound, and he lunged at us, but the flames cut him off. The woman shrieked, her voice blending with the crackle of the fire. We ran, stumbling through the smoke, bursting out of the church just as the roof collapsed behind us in a shower of sparks. We kept running, not stopping until we were far enough away to see the old building fully engulfed, the flames reaching high into the night sky. We stood there, gasping for breath, watching the fire consume the church. For a moment, it felt like we'd done it, like we'd put an end to whatever evil had been lurking out there. But then, through the roar of the fire, I heard it.
Faint, but unmistakable.
A woman's voice, whispering on the wind. You can't escape. Dan looked at me, his face pale. Roy, you hear that? I nodded, my heart sinking. Yeah, I hear it. And I knew in that moment that whatever we'd done, it wasn't over.
Not by a long shot.
The road ahead was still dark, and whatever was out there in the shadows, it wasn't done with us yet. And maybe, just maybe, it never would be.